According to the Federal Reserve, the top 10% now hold nearly 3/4 of the nation's wealth, with billionaire net worth having doubled in just the last 4 years. And with the average member of Congress now worth over $8 million, decades of systemic neglect have left 60% of the workforce unable to afford even the basic cost of living. Raising the question, when did exploiting the working class become the nation's business model? While the pursuit of independence has often been driven by resistance to elite rule, the foundation of society has consistently carried an ideology that placed power back into the hands of a select few. One of the earliest examples dates back to Jamestown, where Captain John Smith, a key leader who helped establish the first permanent English settlement, famously declared, "He who shall not work shall not eat." And while this is often assumed to be directed at the poor or unmotivated, it was actually aimed at wealthy gentlemen who arrived expecting the New World to be a land of leisure, believing prosperity would spring forth from rivers overflowing with gold, and that work itself was beneath them. But unlike the endless toil-consuming modern American society, Smith observed, if a man work but 3 days in 7, he may get more than he can spend, unless he will be excessive. However, that vision never materialized, as a supposed accidental gunpowder explosion forced an injured Smith to return to England, where British authorities imposed the statute of artificers across the colonies, requiring all Englishmen, except the wealthy elite, to labor from sunrise to sunset, reframing work as a service to God, where prosperity signified divine favor, and idleness was branded the devil's workshop. And as poverty soon spread, the colonies also adopted Europe's poor laws, where relief often meant the loss of property, voting rights, freedom of movement, or being forced to wear a large P to publicly mark one's poverty. Punishments for discouraging dependency ranged from prison and whipping to branding, stoning, or even death, embedding a deeply ingrained cultural belief that even in the face of dangerous working conditions, unlovable wages, or the simplest misfortune, you did not question the system or ask for help. Instead, you worked harder, hoping at some point to regain life's good graces, while those who stood in God's favor allowed little room for compassion or empathy, as another's misfortune could only be seen as the consequences of idleness, stripping workers from their humanity and setting the foundation of an ideology that has consumed modern society. The propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human. Despite the nation's public education system often being credited to Horace Mann, otherwise known as the father of American education, the model that ultimately shaped both the United States and Canada was drawn directly from Mann's travels to Prussia, or modern-day Germany. After Prussia's defeat to Napoleon in 1806, the loss was blamed not on military strategy, but on soldiers having too much free will. To correct this, philosopher Johann Fichte, known as the father of German nationalism, declared, education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than their schoolmasters would have wished. He argued that once perfected, any government that controlled education for more than one generation would be able to rule its subjects securely, without armies or policemen. But unlike Prussia's militaristic focus, American education, backed by Rockefeller's immense investment in 1902, was designed to remove free will and replace it with the obedience to work and the desire to consume. Rockefeller's advisor and co-founder, Frederick Taylor Gates, expressed the mission plainly. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people, or any of their children, into philosophers, or men of learning, or men of science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. For the task we set before ourselves is a very simple as well as a very beautiful one, to train these people as we find them for a perfectly ideal life, just where they are. And in doing so, education established a personal identity that stripped life of any meaning beyond work, where genuine living was rationed out through the illusions of reward, measured in weekends, the next paycheck, or the empty promises of a 10-cent promotion. Universal literacy was supposed to educate the common man to control his environment. Once he could read and write, he would have a mind fit to rule, so ran the democratic doctrine. But instead of a mind, universal literacy has given him a rubber stamp inked with advertising slogans, editorials, scientific data, tabloid trivialities, and historical platitudes, but innocent of original thought, because education is a powerful auxiliary of propaganda. In fact, the education of the American public has been a large-scale propaganda project. By the time the Industrial Revolution shifted the economy from agriculture to wage-based occupations, work had transformed from self-sufficiency, rooted in community, to complete dependency on employers for continuous wages, where the industrialist mentality was summed up by Jay Gould, who boasted, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." With workers so divided, most attempts to close the widening income gap and improve brutal working conditions largely failed, as most of the violence came not from the top, but from workers struggling to agree on what they were even fighting for, leaving the working class to once again fall back onto the cultural conditioning to just work harder, resulting in an average 6-day workweek, with many industries routinely exceeding 100 hours a week, only for workers to return home to overcrowded, rat-infested slums. However, Henry Ford recognized that a workforce unable to afford the very products it built, or the time to enjoy them, posed a direct threat to both business and economic growth. To address this, he implemented a standardized 8-hour day, 6 days a week, while raising wages to $5 per day, roughly $158 when adjusted for inflation, or more than double the industry standard. Ford also announced he would stop issuing special dividends, choosing instead to reinvest profits into building the world's largest automobile plant. He explained, "My ambition is to employ still more men, to spread the benefits of this industrial system to the greatest possible number, to help them build up their lives and their homes. To do this, we are putting the greatest share of our profits back into the business," where his vision of corporate responsibility soon put him at odds with his own investors, whom he viewed as parasitic entities, contributing nothing to production, yet demanding ever higher returns at the expense of workers and consumers, leading to minority shareholders, John and Horace Dodge, to sue, arguing it violated their rights as investors, where in 1919, the Michigan Supreme Court ultimately sided with the Dodge brothers, ruling that Ford's vision of expanding operations, raising wages, and lowering prices was legally secondary to maximizing shareholder profits, setting a precedent which reshaped corporate priorities across the nation, enshrining the investor over the worker and profit over the public good. Where this prioritization of endless profit manifested itself into the engineering of the American mind into that of a consumer. Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers expanded on this in the Harvard Business Review in 1927. "We must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old had been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs," further entrenching the nation's use of propaganda, later rebranded as public relations, to engineer the American mind. Citizens were taught to look away from politics, unstable economics, and civil unrest, and instead obsess over the color of their car or the brand of their kitchen appliances. Where just months before the Great Depression, the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, gave a speech to young aspiring advertisers stating, "You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines, machines which have become the key to economic progress, establishing a cultural belief that Americans were no longer citizens, nor humans for the matter, but consumerist happiness machines on their trajectory of owning nothing and being told to be happy about it. The public must be put in its place so that each of us may live a life free of the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. The common interests elude public opinion entirely and can be managed only by a specialized class whose personal interests reach beyond the locality. The task of this class is not to burden itself with the impossible task of making the masses competent, but to conduct public affairs in such a way to keep the public from meddling." Following World War II, acts of organized unity in the fight for social and economic justice challenged the very construct of engineered consent that had consumed the nation for decades, prompting American economist Milton Friedman to publish his 1970 Friedman Doctrine, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits," where he claimed, "The businessmen believe they are defending free enterprise when they declaim that business is not concerned merely with profit, but also with promoting desirable social ends, that business has a social conscience and takes seriously its responsibilities for providing employment, eliminating discrimination, avoiding pollution, and whatever else may be the catchwords of the contemporary crop of reformers. In fact, they are, or would be if anyone else took them seriously, preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. Businessmen who talk this way are unwitting puppets of the intellectual forces that have been undermining the basis of a free society these past decades." Once again establishing the societal narratives that nothing is more important than the depths of shareholders' pockets. To turn this philosophy into action, corporate lawyer Lewis Powell issued the 1971 Powell Memorandum, warning of a coordinated assault on the American economic system led by bright young men on college campuses being taught to distrust or even despise free market principles. Powell urged corporations to counter this perceived threat through public relations campaigns, aggressive lobbying, and an influence over political and educational institutions. By the late 1970s, the effects were clear. Corporate public affairs offices in Washington had grown from 100 to over 500, with nearly 2,500 corporations registering lobbyists by 1982. At the same time, he called on business leaders to saturate the media with pro-corporate voices and to fund think tanks capable of producing research to legitimize corporate interests, where in the process, the nation abandoned John F. Kennedy's call to not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer, replacing unity with a carefully engineered debate of left versus right, a distraction that has kept the public divided, while the only right answer has become whatever allows a select few to accumulate even greater riches. Reagan's blueprints showed how to manipulate the hearts of workers, engineering genuine concern for their economic and social struggles, while openly admitting that policies designed to protect their jobs don't make good policy sense. Clinton proved how data can tell two stories. While headlines praised rising household income during his presidency, the reality was that millions of American jobs were outsourced, and families only appeared richer because the average household was working an extra 6 weeks each year, longer than workers in every advanced economy except for Portugal. And yet, in just these two examples, more is revealed than in 50 years of political debate, because it has always been easier to point blame at the left or the right than to confront the reality of a system built on demanding that anyone facing worse conditions than their neighbor to merely pick themselves up by their bootstraps. It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. For 50 years, America has lived under the promise of returning to its former glory. Yet few have even paused to ask what that actually means. Are we clawing back to the homes and consumer goods once attainable on factory wages? If so, we must stop ignoring that the era was also defined by unresolved economic and social injustice, the constant fear of nuclear catastrophe, and the immense deaths of pointless wars. Or maybe it's a return to the early 1900s, when simply being an American nearly guaranteed a job, though that did come with 10% of the workforce being children and roughly 10% of the US population living in rat-infested slums. But perhaps that is the vision, as the Department of Labor reports a 44% increase in children employed illegally between October 2022 and July of 2023, while homelessness has surged 30% in just 3 years. But the greatness could also be referencing the dream to just return to a simpler life, when hard work and dedication provided a house on the prairie, though only at the cost of whipping or stoning your neighbor for the crime of misfortune. For I believe to be the only thing worth carrying forward from the past is the essence that once truly defined America, the hope that ordinary people could bend the system towards something better. It was this hope that allowed the Continental Army of farmers and tradesmen to face a British force twice its size just for the chance to build a society free from tyranny. It was this hope that carried a self-taught lawyer from Kentucky to lead a bitterly divided nation and preserve a government of the people, by the people, and for the people from becoming nothing more than an idealistic fantasy. It was this hope that caused Jacob Riis to photograph the horrors of tenement housing and How the Other Half Lives, prompting landmark housing reform in 1890. In fact, not long ago, America's youth had hope for a better tomorrow, as they could look to the youngest president in history, reminding them that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. They could look to leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, who offered a bridge to those who felt the system was out of reach. But the real hope was just outside their windows, and the thousands of ordinary people, blue and white-collar workers, private and public school students, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, ministers and worshipers of every age, ethnicity, and gender, gathering under the same banner of dignity, justice, and nonviolence. And it is now time that we break free from the false political and corporate narratives, remove our hands from each other's throats, and direct our attention on what is really happening in society. America's youth should not be forced to work 3 jobs just to survive, while institutional investors are buying up 40% of single-family housing. We should not still be debating whether people deserve a livable wage, as CEO stock-based compensation is up 1,460%. Child poverty should not be rising, while billionaires pay a lower effective tax rate than the average American. And we cannot keep pouring billions of dollars of taxpayer funds into endless wars abroad while our own country is crumbling before our very eyes. Yet even in the face of these failures, hope is not lost, because hope has never lived only in great speeches. It has lived in ordinary people showing up despite all odds. It lives in the smallest of gestures, of waving to a neighbor, listening to a concerned voice, or picking up a piece of trash. For these acts are no less important than those who choose to organize, or to speak, or to build. For every unified step in a forward direction creates a tiny ripple of hope. For the purpose of life is to contribute in some way to making things better.
It is the young people who must take the lead. Thus you and your young compatriots everywhere have had thrust upon you a greater burden of responsibility than any generation that has ever lived. Yet this is the measure of the task of your generation, and the road is strewn with many dangers. First is the danger of futility, the belief there is nothing one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills, against misery, against ignorance, or injustice and violence. Yet many of the world's great movements of thought and action have flowed from the work of a single man. Give me a place to stand, said Archimedes, and I will move the world. These men move the world, and so can we all. Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the event, and in the total, all of these acts will be written in the history of this generation.